Okay, so our topic is socioeconomic inequality, and there's a variety of questions or themes that we can examine. Some of them fall into the category of positive economics. So what I'm going to spend a bit of time explaining is how we could measure inequality. Now, it turns out that there are many different measurements, and I'm really just going to give you one. If you're interested in this stuff, we have a course, Economics 2213, which deals with economic inequality, poverty, and what to do about those things. That's going to be offered next year by Professor Watson. So anyway, we'll just get an introduction in this course. We can look at the relationship between inequality and other things. I've sort of already done that in thinking about the social determinants of health. So that falls under positive economics because we're just measuring things and we're supposing that there's a theory that links the two. Once we've measured inequality, we can see whether it's been changing or not, and if it has been, which is the case, then we can see if we can come up with some explanations about what might be causing that. We can also ask, what effects do economic policies have on influencing inequality? That's a pretty big topic, and we'll just touch on a few ideas there. Well, of course, the first thing I suppose that everybody would think of is really a normative question, the question about whether the inequality that we're observing in our society, however you measure it, whether it's income inequality or wealth inequality, we could ask whether there's a problem. Is inequality too large? Or could you even argue that inequality should be greater? Well, let's first turn to the issue of measurement. When we think about measuring inequality, the first thing I think that we need to think about is, well, what do we want to measure? We've got a variety of choices. We could measure people's incomes, measured in different ways, as we'll see. We could try and measure wealth, that is the assets that people own, or we could look at what people are actually consuming. Because after all, if we think about our simple theory of utility and simple theory of the consumer, it's consumption that is giving people utility. So perhaps inequality of consumption is important. We can say whose income, whose wealth, whose consumption are we interested in? Are we interested in looking at individuals, or are we interested in families or households? I think one could make a case for families because presumably a lot of things are shared within the family. Are we interested in inequality in smaller places like New Brunswick? Or are we thinking about countries like Canada or the United States and so on? Or are we even thinking about the whole world? There are some economists who specialize actually in looking at inequality from the point of view of the world as a whole, not just the individual country. What we're going to stick to here is thinking about the Canadian situation, in part because economic policy to deal with that takes place at the national level in large part. Well, of course, we also need to ask how we're going to measure inequality. So what I'm going to do is just give you an example of how you can measure that in Canada. What we typically do is look at annual incomes. So that's a judgment, I guess, we make because that income is readily available. And what is very often done is to divide the population up into groups from the lowest income to the highest income. And in this case, as in my very first example, we're dividing households up according to quintiles. So, in other words, fifths. And what I'm showing you here is what's called market income. So that's the income that people get from wages, salaries, any rental income they might receive, and income from investments. So the kind of income it does not include are, say, money that the government might send you, and it does not include any taxes that you might pay. So the most recent year for which we have this data is 2017. So let's just walk through it and see how things look. So this is telling us that the fifth of the population that have the lowest income have 3.5% of total market income. So they're 20% of the population. They have 3.5% of the income. If we look at the next 20%, they have 9.2% of market income. If we add those two groups together, we just kind of keep track of the total, that's telling us that the bottom 40% of the population in terms of market income have 12.7% of market income in total. So in other words, just the sum of these two values. If we take the next 20%, they've got 15% of market income. So that's telling us that 60% of the population has just under 30% of total income, and so on. So the bottom 80% of the population has just over half of total income. So that means that the top fifth, the top 20%, have almost half of total income. So, of course, 100% of the population has 100% of the income. Well, we can summarize this data in a nice, neat picture. So let's do that. And this picture is called a Lorentz curve. So all I've done is just divide our population up into fifths here. And I plotted on the vertical axis the cumulative share of income that we've got. So the lowest quintile, as we saw, had 3.5% of total income. The second quintile, once we include the second quintile, as we saw in the previous table, they had 12.7% of total income. So that's what this value is across here. And so on up to the fifth quintile, where 100% of cumulative income is received by the entire population. So here we saw that the bottom 80% had just over half of total income. Now, what's this dashed line across here? Well, this is kind of a line of reference, you might say. It shows us what would happen if the bottom 20% of the population actually had 20% of the income, and 40% of the population, the first two quintiles, had 40% of total income. In other words, if income were equally divided across the entire population, then the Lorentz curve would lie on that diagonal line. Now, nobody's saying that income should be evenly distributed across everyone, but that's simply, as I say, kind of a reference point. So how far away this Lorentz curve is from this line of equality tells us something about how unequally income is distributed in Canada. That is market income. Okay, there's a value, a number we can calculate using that, and that is called the Gini coefficient. I mentioned that when I was talking about that second example earlier on. So the Gini coefficient is just the ratio of this area A here that tells us how far away the Lorentz curve is from this line of equality to the size of this overall triangle. So you can see the further away the Lorentz curve is, the larger the Gini coefficient is going to be. So this Gini coefficient ranges from 0, where the Lorentz curve is right along that line of equality, so A would be 0. That area here would simply disappear. Or if one person or one household had everything, then A would take up that entire space. So in that very unrealistic situation, the Gini coefficient would take the value of 1. So, of course, countries have Gini coefficients that range somewhere in the middle of those two values. Well, I want to just give you an illustration of how government policy can influence the Lorentz curve and therefore the Gini coefficient. So what this is showing is, again, income data for Canada in 2017. On the left-hand side here in this column, we see the values that we've seen before. Here I've labeled primary income. That's the same thing as what I've been calling market income. Disposable income, on the other hand, includes the effect of taxes and transfers. And that is transfers of cash. I'll give you an example of what those are in a minute. So disposable income just describes what people have got left over to dispose of or to spend once they've paid their taxes and once they've received any money that they might be getting from the government. Well, if we just look at the shares of disposable income that each fifth of the population has, you can see that after the tax and transfer system has done its work, that has significantly increased the share of income that the lowest fifth has. And it's also increased the share that the second fifth has as well, and the same for the third group. So in other words, the bottom 60% of the population in terms of market income now have greater shares of total income than they did before taxes and transfers. So in other words, the tax and transfer system is acting to reduce income inequality. The top 40% of the population now have smaller shares of total income than they did before. Well, let's see exactly how that's brought about. I'll, in the next set of slides, have a look at the specific taxes and transfers that bring this about.